Hello, my name is Michael Carleton, and this is my social psychology final project in which I research the bystander effect. In this presentation, you'll find some of the research that I found, including who brought about the initial studies on the bystander effect, how it came about, and some ways in which we can mitigate ourselves from becoming apathetic bystanders. Finally, you'll see an interview with a former Vail firefighter, now a Denver firefighter, on some of the ways that he educates people in being an active bystander. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So on the first slide, we have the definition, and according to the 12th edition of Social Psychology by David Myers and Gene Twenge, the bystander effect is the finding that a person is less likely to help someone when there are other bystanders present. That is, the more people that are present, the less likely any one person is to help. While many would say that this does not apply to them, I'm sure that we can all think of a time where we saw someone pulled over on the highway and did not stop to help them, or when witnessing something that appears to be a criminal or someone who looks sketchy committing a minor crime, looking around to see what others are doing, to see if they've noticed the crime and if it's really worth mentioning, only to heed their warnings not to make a big deal over something you're not sure about or not to get involved. To illustrate this point, I've created a visual example. In the image you can see there's a man lying on the ground. Now we don't know whether he's potentially injured, drunk, ill, or even dead. But we can see that there are two bystanders nearby and neither of them are tending to the man. As far as we know, they haven't asked him if he's okay. They haven't even tried to make sure that he's alive for that sake. The man who is walking out the door is deflecting the responsibility onto the woman. He believes that she will help, and she has no interest in helping as she thinks that he's just tired and maybe taking a nap there on the ground. So both are assuming that he's fine or will be cared for by someone else, and ultimately this man is a victim of the bystander effect. So, how did the bystander effect come into play in the first place? What sparked the experiment, and how did social psychologists know to study this phenomenon? Excuse me. So it all started out with John Darley and Bib Latané. They were the first social psychologists to study the bystander effect, and as we'll discuss later, it came about from a woman who was murdered in front of her apartment in Queens, New York City, and despite the many residents in the building, only two of them stepped in to help, and she ultimately died of her injuries. So, to study this, they theorized that the increase in bystanders causes each person to feel less responsible for helping. So, in order to actually carry out the experiment in a lab, they simulated an emergency epileptic seizure in which another participant who heard it over an intercom was the only one, and then they tested it by adding more participants and more participants, or so they believed, to see what the response rate of the participants were. So ultimately, the way that this turned out is that most of the participants who thought they were alone responded and sought help. This is because they concluded that those who were alone felt the most pressure to help with the emergency. They knew that no one else would come to the aid of the woman, and it was on them to make sure that she received the medical help she required. So, unfortunately, as we increased the participants, or as they increased the participants, only 31% of the participants who thought they were with four others notified the experimenter. Now, that is a significant drop from the initial one of the participant and the other woman who was said to have the seizure. And these results suggested that personality factors such as apathy and indifference were not actually the cause of the lack of intervention, but rather it was diffusion of responsibility, which we'll get to in the next slide. So, as I mentioned, the diffusion of responsibility is one of the major causes of the bystander effect. And according to the APA, the diffusion of responsibility is the diminished sense of responsibility that members of a group or social collective often feel And this can mean that as there are more people, an individual feels more a part of the crowd. They're less responsible for their own actions. They're less responsible for providing help to others. Another big influencer is the confusion of responsibility. And this is also from the APA definition as well. And that is the tendency for bystanders to refrain from helping in both emergencies and non-emergency in order to avoid being blamed by others for causing the problem. When in a group, social influence can have a large effect on the way that we act, the way that we behave. Non-verbally, since we're children, we look around to see how others behave, how others react to something. And if we see that others are not stopping to help someone on the road, we assume that, maybe they know something we do not. Maybe someone else has already come by, they've seen someone else come by. And so social influence plays a large part in the bystander effect, in that if we see someone else not helping, we're less likely to help. Finally, time pressures are a big one. If someone's in a rush, they're told that they were late in an experiment conducted, they were less likely to help. And in general, people who are running late versus have time to spare are going to be more rushed, less likely to notice that, more tunnel vision, and more focused on getting where they need to go rather than stopping to help a potentially injured bystander. So there have been many notable cases of the bystander effect, but a few of them I listed out here. So Catherine Kitty Genovese, we'll get to her in a second. Richmond High School incident in which there was a rape that was seen by many people. Wang Yue, or Little Yue Yue, called by her family, was a young Chinese girl who was run over by a truck, and despite being on the road, many cars drove around her. None of them stopped to see if she was okay, stopped to help her, or even stopped to remove her body from the road. And eventually she was run over by a truck and killed. And finally, Kevin Carter's picture is the vulture and the child. And this is a South African photojournalist who, upon walking, saw a child stop to get some rest and a vulture about to spread its wings on the child. And rather than stop to shoo the vulture away, help the child, he waited to get the good photo, and even after he had gotten it, he left the child as it was and did not help them. So let's go ahead and talk about Catherine or Kitty Genovese. So this woman was killed in 1964 outside her apartment in Queens, New York. Her attack lasted over 30 minutes, and she was stabbed 14 times. She was murdered, raped, and robbed. And only 2 residents of the reported 38 ended up helping in the building. Many of them said that they did not want to get involved and they didn't think that it was their business. This crime, however, is credited as one of the crimes that pushed the 911 system into place. Ultimately, what happened was, after being stabbed, she crawled into her apartment building. The attacker was initially scared off, and despite calling for help, she laid in the hallway of her apartment, and the attacker eventually returned and raped and robbed and ended up killing her. The people who were around eventually did end up calling the police, but a friend even called his friend to see what he should do, and he told him not to get involved, and this became a famous line of this case. So how do we overcome the bystander effect? So using some of the research, a few steps are outlined here. So Bickman, and Green they conducted a shoplifter experiment, and they found that interpreting the situation out loud can help give people a sense of responsibility. Just announcing what's going on, kind of getting other people's take, and analyzing the situation can help others feel a need to take action. Solomon and Solomon found that reducing anonymity through introducing yourself increases the likelihood that someone will offer help. This makes someone feel more close to you, more as though they know you, and this gives them a personal stake in the matter. Making people aware of a mirror increased the likelihood they will help. So being self-aware in theft, in bystander effect, and in many other social psychology studies has changed the outcome in that we're aware of our own behavior, we act more ideal. And finally, excluding someone from our zone of moral concern is not the way to go. We need to make sure to include everyone, and because that justifies different kinds of harm and discrimination. A few steps to overcome it. If you're being victimized, try to make eye contact with the people nearby. This creates a sense of personalization. If you're a bystander, act. Understand that if you don't help, someone may not. If you see conflict, try and diffuse it. Try and get in there, try and stop it, break up a fight, call others to help you. And if you see someone who's injured, then you ask them if they're okay. If not, call the cops. And finally, maybe it's worth it to get trained, get first aid training, seek other training, read about it, inform yourself on some of the ways that you can avoid becoming an apathetic bystander. So for a point of time, I won't go ahead and show this video, but this is a great link for a man who non-aggressively stops a fight on a subway, and I recommend watching that. Finally, we have an interview that I conducted with a fail firefighter, Colton Fitbin. He ultimately recommended that if you see something, call 911 or tell someone else to. Colton is a former Vail firefighter with 4 years of experience as a first responder. His big takeaway was to call 911 if you believe that you have seen something that requires the attention of first responders. Whether it's smoke coming from a house, a person lying on the ground, you're not sure is breathing, or an accident on the highway, it's important to call 911 and report things. And whether or not it turns out to be a problem, you will not get in trouble unless you're submitting false reports. So thank you so much for coming to my presentation, and I appreciate you listening. Thank you.